Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine. Feeling a bit flat at the moment. This is supposed to be the intro to the Film Stories podcast. Oh, hang on, who's this?
Uh-oh. Sounds like somebody's got a case of the Mondays.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. As always, there's absolutely everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, I'm here to talk of the stories of film, and I tend to talk about development stories, marketing stories, production stories, release stories, all the bits and bobs, really, that go to make the films that we know and sometimes love. Just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to choose this podcast, they have more of a mainstream leaning to them than anything else. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I try not to punch down. I try not to do snark. This podcast is a celebration. It's a celebration of films, the fact that they get made. It's really hard to get made, to make them, and I want to salute the people who do so. With that in mind, my preamble is over. I'm going to crack on with the first of the two episodes I want to talk about in this episode. I'm going to go back to the early 2000s. I'll play you a clip. I'll come to the story of this one, the other side of this.
There were 24 kidnappings in Mexico City in the last 6 days. Have you protected a lot of children before, Mr. Creasy?
I don't know. Bodyguards gotta be close to people. You know, I'm no good at that.
You're the silent type. People are gonna appreciate that.
16 years of military experience, extensive counter-terrorism work.
What happened to your hand?
It's a birth defect.
No, it's not.
No more questions, that's it. Period, you hear me?
Peter just wants to be friends.
I regret that your profession needs to exist.
So do I, Marjorie.
He's like a bear.
Yeah?
Big, sad bear. Good things happen too, Creasy.
Yeah? Like what?
Like meeting me. Creasy, you're smiling.
Peter! Peter!
That then was a clip from 2004's movie Man on Fire, directed by the late Tony Scott, from a screenplay by Brian Helgeland, based on the book Man on Fire by A.J. Quinnell, and starring Denzel Washington, Dakota Fanning, Christopher Walken, Giancarlo Giannini, Radha Mitchell, Mark Antony and Mickey Rourke, all in the ensemble cast for this one. Now, the story of Man on Fire goes back to a man called Philip Nicholson, who had a story in him and pieced together this tale as a novel and published it under the pseudonym A.J. Quinnell. Now, that book came out in 1980 and it hit big and it hit fast. It was the story of a man called John Creasy, a former military operative, one who was going very much on the downside of life at that point in time, who landed a job protecting a young girl from kidnap in Italy in the 1980s. Now, the setting of Italy was important at that point because kidnap rates in Italy were quite high, and so it seemed to fit. And this was a project in which Hollywood was quickly interested, and so was a young filmmaker by the name of Tony Scott. Now, Tony Scott had, at this stage, landed on the scene with his first movie as director, which was The Hunger. That had been that had been released in 1983, and the thinking was this was going to be his second film. So, I mean, work began along with producer Arne Milken on getting this film together. It was going to be set in Italy, and the version that Tony Scott and Arne Milken envisaged at that point would have had Marlon Brando potentially in the role of John Creasy. He was certainly offered it. He turned down the part in the end due to the physicality of it. He just didn't feel he could do it. Then a younger Robert De Niro was attached, and Tony Scott got to the point where he went off off to Milan and was scouting for locations for the movie. But gradually it fell apart. At this point, Robert De Niro became detached from the film, and Tony Scott moved on to make a different film that was gathering pace that he thought might be a good career move. It was called Top Gun. Yeah, wonder what happened. So in the end, what happened with Man on Fire, at least, was a movie of it was made back in 1987. This one saw Scott Glenn in the lead role, Joe Pesci amongst the supporting cast. Elie Shirakwai directed the film, and in fairness, it pretty much came and went. Although one of the places it went was to a then burgeoning writer Brian Helgeland's local video shop. And in the late 1980s, he picked up a copy of the film and saw it. And it's a very Hollywood story, this. It almost sounds too Hollywood perfect, but he went, apparently, it's been told a couple of times, to the video shop where Quentin Tarantino was working. Quentin Tarantino recommended the video to Brian Helgeland, little knowing that these two would go on to have quite careers in the movie business. Helgeland watched the film anyway, and he was interested in it, but they pretty much left it at that. So we then wind forward the story over a decade. We get to 2001, and Arne Milken at this point was channel surfing late night, and he saw the 1987 version of Man on Fire, and he had a look, and he appreciated he still actually had the rights to do something with this story, and so he rang up Tony Scott and asked if he'd be interested in resurrecting the film. So this was the era when Tony Scott was doing films like Spy Game. That was the one he did immediately beforehand. And Scott was interested. He liked the idea of it. And then, again, in a very Hollywoody story, off he went for some acupuncture. That he had an appointment a few days later. And what do you know? Who walked in? Denzel Washington. Now, Washington and Scott had worked before on the 1995 film Crimson Tide. I covered that a long time ago on the Film Stories podcast. And as Denzel Washington was there and he had the Project Man on Fire in his head, he began to see Denzel in the character of John Creasy. Now, he didn't mention it to him at this point, but also already in Tony Scott's head was Dakota Fanning to take on the role of the young girl in the movie, and the contrast between the two of them really struck him. Now, the one thing that goes against this story that was widely put around at the time of release was a subsequent interview that Tony Scott did with the Sunday Times, where he also said he'd sounded out Russell Crowe about taking on the role of John Creasy. And as Scott relayed, he said, I called Crowe while he was on the set of Master and Commander, did that in a previous podcast as well, and he said, Man on Fire. And Crowe reportedly said, have you seen the film Proof of Life? I've been there and I've done that. Now, quite where the offer to Russell Crowe came in, I couldn't tell you, but it was fairly clear fairly early on that this was going to be a reunion for Tony Scott and Denzel Washington. Now, at this point, Brian Helgeland had been called in by Arne Milken to write a screenplay for the movie as well, and obviously remembering the previous film, he was keen and he was happy to do so. Now, Tony Scott at this stage in his career was juggling several potential projects, so the carrot that was dangled for Brian Helgeland was that he might be able to direct this one as well, that there was a possibility of that, and that's what he really wanted to do. And so he penned a screenplay that again set the action in Italy, and the problem was, as much as Scott was juggling other projects, he really liked what Helgeland had written and he wanted to direct the film himself. Now, it wasn't a bad runner-up prize for Brian Helgeland to write the screenplay for a Tony Scott movie, particularly one that was looking to be made at some scale, and thus he stayed aboard the project, which meant that he was in charge of basically a reset of the location that was required, because had they opted to press ahead with making the film as an Italian story, they figured they'd have to make it a period piece, that they'd have to set it at the very least back in the 1980s, because in the intervening time, the kidnap rate in Italy had dramatically fallen. Conversely, the kidnap rate in Latin America was an awful lot higher, and Tony Scott thus took Brian Helgeland off on a research trip to Mexico, and they felt that this was the more natural home for the story. One of the offshoots of that research trip was a lot more Mexican detail was added to the script, and this was going to be an action thriller now with a Mexican setting. Now, Fox, the studio behind this, was still keen to have an Italian base for it. The problem of filming on location in an area notorious for kidnapping, well, it doesn't sound enormously secure for a Hollywood production, and that would be something that they came up against. But Scott dug his feet in over this. There were two options in the end that he felt he had for the film. Mexico was the one that won out. They looked seriously at setting Man on Fire in Brazil as well, but ultimately the story just felt more organic. That felt that it sat a little bit easier and a little bit more realistically in Mexico. Now, part of Scott's process was always that he would go out and he would try and find real life role models for his characters. He talks extensively on the disc commentary for Man on Fire about how he had a background. His background was in painting, and a lot of it was on instinct. And when he found people that he felt reflected the characters, when he was doing his location scouting, that reflected the characters on screen, well, he was drawn to that, and that helped him put the film together. He also wanted, as well as Hollywood stars, to make sure that the film had a high quotient of Latin American actors in the film. In fact, lots of extras also drawn from Mexico for him. Now, the studio kept pushing back on bits and bobs. Some of the things that Fox was nervous about, really, was, well, first of all, Denzel Washington having a beard for a long period of the film. They weren't particularly keen on that, so there was some to and fro going there. But also the script that Helgeland had written was effectively two films in one. And again, Scott talks about this in that director's commentary, that the first chunk of the film is effectively a love story of sorts. The second chunk of the film is a revenge story. And the studio and the studio executives and the notes that were coming back was there were real worries about would all this actually glue together? Is it a single coherent story? Now, Brian Helgeland wasn't in the slightest bit nervous about this. His argument was life takes left turns, and thus the film and the screenplay reflects that. And it was a battle, really, that Helgeland and Tony Scott ultimately won with Fox, although there would be more to come. Now, Dakota Fanning, who's 9 or 10 at the point she took on this particular role, she'd done mainly family stuff to this point, and so it was seen as a huge risk, really, and a real leap for her. And she read for Tony Scott, and then she came in and read with Tony Scott and Denzel Washington, and both were really taken with her performance. And in fact, it was Bonnie Timmerman, who a legendary Hollywood casting director, who brought her to the attention of the pair as well, and she would say it was one of the easiest bits of casting in the film. Now, Scott went back into his contacts book and got in touch with Christopher Walken. He brought him in for True Romance. I've covered that in a previous podcast as well. Walken was happy to come back on board. There was a lot of improvisation with the role that he took on. And Scott also gambled on on offering Mickey Rourke another career revival. Now, he'd had a few. I mean, Sylvester Stallone had brought him into the Get Carter remake a few years previous, for instance. And in fact, off the back of Man on Fire, it would pave a path for Mickey Rourke to get his Oscar-nominated role in The Fighter, which would follow a few years later. But Rourke duly took on a role as well. And Scott built into the production schedule for this sufficient rehearsal time, in particular so Denzel Washington and Dakota Fanning could get used to acting against one another. Now, because they were shooting on location, there was a lot of pre-production work. There was a lot of location shooting, scouting that needed to be done. And also, they knew they were going to shoot bits and bobs at night as well. And so Scott told this story of one particular bit of location scouting late at night. And they went into what was regarded as a more dangerous area in Mexico. And Scott knew that there was a risk. They took one bodyguard with them. They soon found themselves surrounded by a crowd. The bodyguard pulled his gun. The crowd reciprocated. All of a sudden, lots of guns had been pulled. Along came a police officer who tried to quell it, but then he was outnumbered as well. And Scott tells a story of how the bodyguard got beaten, the police officer got beaten, and then ran away. And in the end, Scott and his team were able to escape as fast as they could and to get the bodyguard out. The bodyguard, as Scott tells the tale, just needed a new teeth and a rebuilt nose. And it was incidents like this that just increased 20th Century Fox's fear about shooting Man on Fire in Mexico. They really wanted to get the production out of there and onto somewhere that was a little steadier. because also Scott was drawing on stories of real life kidnappers from the Mexico area, and that was informing events in the film. So there's a kidnap story at the heart of the movie where family members are involved in the money drop-offs, and these were tactics that they took from real life kidnappers and tried to make it as realistic as possible. And also the final piece of preparation really that Tony Scott did before he started shooting this one was something he did on lots of his films, that before he took on a movie, he would do some experimenting, that he would go back to his roots and he would take on some advert work. And in this case, he took on an ad for BMW and tried some techniques in that with a view to, if this works, I'll be able to try them in my next film. And so he was doing things like using English subtitles, but having English dialogue and things like that. And Fox again, I mean, Scott was relaying to Fox that he intended to use quite a lot of subtitles in the film, and the studio was nervous about that. But again, he was standing his ground. And Scott also took as a huge influence on the movie the terrific film City of God. If you've never seen that, that is quite a piece of work. And he drew on the look, the style, and some of the personnel actually from that film made it into Man on Fire as well. And so by April 2003, the film was ready to go before cameras, and it would shoot primarily on location in Mexico for 3-4 months. There were other bits of shooting that took place in America and Italy, and Larry Taylor did a really good book on Tony Scott published by McFarlane and Company that's worth digging out, and he relays the story there of just what a fraught production this was, just in terms of cast and crew safety, that bodyguards were on set at all times to keep them safe because they were a target. It was a big Hollywood film shooting in a dangerous area, and there were close and dangerous moments during the shooting of the movie. The police at one stage told Tony Scott that the crew of the film were basically being seen as a target for kidnappers, that there were stories that various members of the crew were robbed throughout the production, and whilst Fox was hiring armed security guards, there were still problems that they were coming up against throughout the filming of the movie. Now, the studio was spooked by this, that Fox really wasn't pleased again. I mean, a lot of the story of this episode of Film Stories is Fox having problems, as we're going to see in the next film I talk about as well. But they were in the Nizza area around Mexico, and the studio was really wanting to pull the plug on the film and just relocate it elsewhere. And Scott, in the end, I mean, he'd been down this road with movie executives before and having to assuage their fears. He worked out a deal with the studio on it, which basically boiled down to, leave it to me. You don't have to visit the set. I'll get this done. You just trust me. And Scott had the force of character to be able to get that through the studio. But then, as a lot of the set reports and interviews around the time note, that he was really in his element here. I mean, what a loss to filmmaking Tony Scott was. I mean, he was energetic, he was taking chances, he was living heavily on instinct, and he's pretty much at the top of his creative game here. The whole experience of making this film would reignite a working relationship between Tony Scott and Denzel Washington, and they go on to do a couple more productions after this. But also Scott was taking chances with the way that he shot the movie as well, that he was using reversal stock to strengthen the colours, for instance. They were using hand-cranked cameras for certain effects. They were using, I mean, again, it goes to, I'm getting this from the director's commentary and talking about using cross-process to highlight the reality of the negative of the film, bringing in more contrast and vivid colour. They were shooting on location and adapting on location as well. I mean, one huge house we see very early in the film turned out, I mean, they happened upon the house, they thought it was perfect, and the owner had actually died 6 months earlier. So the house in its state was empty and unoccupied. And so not only were they able to shoot there and have the run of the place, it was opulent and it worked on screen, but also they used that as a mini studio, the base of operations for some of the location filming as well. Now, Scott would talk too, even during the shooting of what you would imagine were simple dialogue scenes, he always kept at least 2 cameras. He was determined to have a multi-camera setup on this movie, as he frequently did on his films. And he talked about this, saying that if he was shooting a dialogue scene, and if he could cover that with at least 2 cameras, he wouldn't have to stop it so often and keep going in and asking the actors to restart. And instead, he could just keep the cameras rolling. With one of them, he could do slightly different things and just try things. And then he had one shot that would just be able to cover dialogue. And so he was really adept at having just getting lots of different options for when he headed into the editing room. When he then moved on to doing some of the action sequences in there, even then he wouldn't do that in a standard Hollywood way. That there's a very stylized look that runs right the way through Man on Fire. And if you go to the a particular shootout sequence in the movie, I don't know if you're familiar with it or not, but it's quite an extraordinary sequence. Scott approached that, along with his team, in what he described as a more documentary than a standard cinema shootout style. And the way he approached that was, again, mixing different stocks and techniques and film speeds all within the same sequence. So you see film speeds running from 6 frames per second up to 100 frames per second just within this sequence. You see all sorts of different colour stylings all within it as well. And he describes this gambling with it, really, and going with instinct and experience to get across just various different options again. There's a point where they were hanging out of a helicopter and using a hand crank camera. And if you just kind of think about that for a minute, you have to lean out the helicopter and crank the camera. So, in fact, they used a drill to sort of help them a little bit with that. There were, as much as it was a challenging production, most of it actually went off in the end without a hitch. There's stories that Denzel Washington and Mickey Rourke didn't particularly get on, but that was about as much friction beyond threat to life that I could find with regards to this story. But also, it would turn into quite a transformative film for Denzel Washington, because, if you look at where his career was in 2003 when this was being shot, he just won his Oscar for Training Day at that point, and he'd been playing real life, quite a lot of real life roles. He'd done The Hurricane fairly recently, but then he'd gone on and done a thriller called Out of Time that had underperformed. And the story was really that Denzel Washington was getting just a little bit bored and frustrated with where his career was at that point, and then he's offered this big lead action thriller role that's not based on fact, where he's got the latitude to put together a performance, and he's working with a young performer with whom he was hugely impressed with her work, and this was said to have rocket fueled him a little bit here. There was one further problem that the production had before it could finally get out of Mexico and head to the climes of Hollywood and into the edit, and that's they were briefly hit by a local volcano erupting. Just when you think you've had your fill of problems on a film, what do you know, up pops a volcano. That would delay the final shots of the movie getting in the can, but it would all wrap up by the end of June 2003, where the volcano delayed them by a day or two, and they were away. Man on Fire could go back to the editing room, where Christian Wagner would have the job, along with Tony Scott, of fashioning this into the final cut of the movie. Now, they had a bit of time to put it together. The movie wasn't set for release until April of 2004, and by this stage 20th Century Fox had invested $70 million in the movie. There was quite a lot of jiggling around in post-production, as you would expect, that he had originally intended to open the film with a 6-minute continuous story. There's almost like a prologue to the film that he was going to run, but he experimented here, and he put that prologue as the title sequence you see at the opening of the movie, and that's one of the things that he worked on in post-production and changed the order of the cut a little bit. He would also start experimenting even more with subtitles in the film. Now, again, it goes back to there's quite a lot of subtitles in Man on Fire, and what Scott wanted to do was play with fonts, play with techniques. He wanted to use, even when people were speaking English, he wanted to be able to break into subtitles just to give him something else to play with. The actual visual style of the subtitles was borrowing a little from kung fu movies of old, and they weren't sticking rigidly to a single style. style throughout. Nonetheless, Scott, in the end, he locked down his cut of the movie, and it went before American critics in April 2004, and the reviews were not particularly strong. I mean, it's quite a long film, and there is the argument that it's a film of two halves, but at the point it came out, it was, I mean, at best, the reviews were slightly middling, but I think this is one of those where the reception from audiences was an awful lot stronger. In fact, the reception from the author, A.J. Quinnell, was also a lot more favourable as well, given that he felt it was really quite loyal to the book that he'd originally written. The film opened at the box office then, and it opened with a $22.7 million opening weekend in that April the 23rd to the 25th in the US. It was straight in at number one, just narrowly beating out the film 13 Going on 30, starring Jennifer Garner, which I'm actually going to come to in a future episode of Film Stories. And so Man on Fire had 22.7 million, 13 Going on 30 had 21 million. The others that were hanging around, Kill Bill Volume 2 had opened the week before, and you'd imagine that's a pretty direct piece of competition for Man on Fire, and so that was in third. The Punisher, again aiming at kind of R-rated action fans, that was in fourth place. Disney's Home on the Range, do you remember that one, was hanging around. Scooby-Doo 2 Monsters Unleashed, underrated movie that, I would argue. The first Hellboy film was about. Dwayne Johnson in Walking Tall, Ella Enchanted. Just slipping out of the chart that week was The Passion of the Christ as well. But Man on Fire would hang around for a little bit. It would be dethroned by Mean Girls the following week. But its drop was 34% week on week, which was not seen as particularly worrying, really. And in fact, there was a degree of word of mouth going on with Man on Fire, which grew its American box office take to $77.9 million. Now, outside of America, it didn't do as well, $52 million. Overall worldwide take for an R-rated action movie, at the point those weren't in heavy supply, not least ones that played for nearly 2.5 hours, $130 million. Now, the film would find a much bigger audience on home formats, and this was when the DVD boom was still booming. It hadn't started to drop dramatically at that point, and so Fox comfortably recouped its investment at that stage. Furthermore, there's a growing feeling that it's one of Tony Scott's best films. Now, of course, we tragically lost Tony Scott in 2012 at the age of 68. And Man on Fire in his filmography, following like Enemy of the State and Spy Game, the two films that came immediately before, well, it would start a bit of a run, really, that he would do Domino pretty much straight away with Keira Knightley. The year after, he would do Deja Vu, again with Denzel Washington, and do The Taking of Pelham 1, 2, 3. He would the remake of that came out in 2009. His final film, again made with Denzel Washington, they'd make a further 3 films together, was Unstoppable. In terms of where Man on Fire went from that point onwards, well, the answer would be nowhere, really. There was no sequel. There was talk of following it up at one stage, but I couldn't really find any substance beyond like one or two little bits of tittle tattle. It was remade in Hindi in 2005, but this was a one-off standalone hit, and one that's become a fondly remembered part of Tony Scott's filmography. For Denzel Washington, it would send his career off in a whole other direction as well. I mean, I think this is where you start mapping the path from Denzel Washington to the Equalizer movies, for instance. But all of that, of course, as usual, is a story for another time. And that brings me to the halfway point of this latest episode of Film Stories. So I'm just going to do my parish notices at this point. If you like this podcast and want to support our work, we are on Patreon. Well, I am on Patreon. Patreon.com/Simon Brew. Thank you to everyone who supports me there. The funds from Patreon are used for materials for this podcast. There's quite a lot of research that goes into it. And also I try and give paid writing breaks to people on the Film Stories website. If you want want to support me, patreon.com/Simon Brew. You get podcasts most of the time, unless I'm ill, you get podcasts early. You also get early news on what's going on with the broader Film Stories project and all the little bits and bobs there. If you can subscribe to this podcast, that helps enormously. I am an independent without a big company behind me, so little things like that make a huge difference to algorithms for indies like us. And thank you to everyone who's subscribed. And likewise, on the same lines, if you can ideally leave a hugely positive review, that also helps me enormously too, and I thank you for that. I will be doing more live Film Story shows. Those are coming up. The next one is that's officially confirmed is at the end of March in Birmingham. I'll have more details on those in due course, and I'll have more details in the next episode or two on issue 31 of Film Stories magazine, which I'm very excited about, but I won't tell you any more about that just yet. That's because I'm just going to crack on with the second of the two films I'm talking about in this episode of Film Stories. It's another 20th Century Fox film. It's another Fox film that I had a little bit of trouble with. We're going to 1999. I'm going to play you a clip right now.
Corporate accounts payable. Nina speaking.
Hello, Peter. What's happening? We have sort of a problem here. Yeah, you apparently didn't put one of the new cover sheets on your TPS reports.
Oh, yeah. I'm sorry about that. I forgot.
Yeah. You see, we're putting the cover sheets on all TPS reports now before they go out. Did you see the memo about this?
Yeah. Yeah, I have the memo right here. I just forgot. But it's not shipping out till tomorrow, so there's no problem.
Yeah. If you could just go ahead and make sure you do that from now on, that would be great. And I'll go ahead and make sure you get another copy of that memo. Okay?
Yeah, no, I have the memo. I've got it. It's right.
Hello, Phil. What's happening? I came by here yesterday.
That then is a clip from 1999's terrific comedy Office Space. Office Space being a film written and directed by Mike Judge, based on his own short, Milton, and starring Ron Livingston, Jennifer Aniston, Stephen Root, and Gary Cole. And the story of this goes back to, really a series of short films that Mike Judge made in the early 1990s. Short films about a character called Milton, an unhappy office worker, who was based on Judge's previous unhappy experiences working with in offices. And the short films, they originally just went on smaller outlets on US TV, but they got to a wider audience when they were picked up by Saturday Night Live in 1993, and then they started to hit. By this stage, Judge had made a 16mm film in 1991 called Milton, or Office Space featuring Milton, and this would be the spark for the film that would arrive 5-6 years later. So Mike Judge, just to put it into some kind of context, he's the man behind what would become the big hit animated show King of the Hill. He'd also behind Beavis and Butthead as well. And it was after King of the Hill's successful first season that at that point Judge had got a deal in place with 20th Century Fox. They got a first look development deal, and Peter Chernin, who was then the head of Fox, he was a fan of the Office Space Milton short. Now, he then put to Mike Judge the idea of why not turn this into a motion picture, to which Judge was not massively jumping at the chance to do so, but he was interested enough that once he'd wrapped up that first season of King of the Hill, he took a treatment that he'd been writing for the film and he turned it into a screenplay based in just a standard, everyday, homogenous American office park, and it was written as a satire. Now, satires, as we're about to find out, are not a very easy a subgenre of film to sell, particularly at the American box office, although I think here in the UK we can hardly say they go down a storm either. But still, Tom Rothman, who was someone overseeing 20th Century Fox's slate at the time, and I should say I'm drawing on an excellent Entertainment Weekly oral history of Office Space here as well, he got hold of the script that Mike Judge had written, and it was the right project at the right time, because Fox found itself in a position where it had just spent enormously on James Cameron's Titanic and enjoyed a monster hit with that, and so it was sort of doing all right when it came to big movies and blockbusters at that point, but also it needed some more modest projects to balance the slate out, really. It was an era where a studio was expected to have 15 to 20 films each a year coming out. Remember those days? And so Rothman was on the lookout, particularly for comedies. And he read the script to this one and he absolutely loved it. Now, also, it's worth noting that Fox had enjoyed a hugely profitable hit with the comedy There's Something About Mary around this time as well. And that really opened the studio's eyes to let's find some more modestly costed comedies that we can play to a broad audience and see if we can make similar amounts of money and have a really nice Christmas party. And so Office Space came really up on the radar a little bit with that in mind, that there was the hope that there was a big crossover comedy here somewhere. Now, by late 1997, with the Beavis and Butthead movie, that had become a hit at Paramount, a read-through for Mike Judge's script was organised. There had been various actors got round the table, people like David Herman, Stephen Root, and Judge wasn't convinced by everybody who turned up for that read-through, and there was a point here, reading a couple of interviews he's given, where the film felt just a little bit vulnerable, that he was minded to back away from this one. But still, there was enough in there to make it work, and 20th Century Fox enthusiastically gave Mike Judge a green light for the film. He was going to make his live-action movie directorial debut. It was going to be a modestly budgeted film as well. It was only going to cost $10 million to make, and with that in theory gave Mike Judge some creative control here. After all, if you're spending $10 million in the 1990s, you're not going to get Arnold Schwarzenegger to headline your film. And so that meant, in Judge's mind, that he could get a fairly modest cast together, that he would be able to choose people who were funny rather than marquee stars, and there were no blockbuster expectations on the film, short of the fact, make it funny, make it work, and we might make a good profit on this one. Now, as ever, there's an external influence that comes in on a film that can affect the path of another. And in this case, it was 1997's Good Will Hunting. That was a modestly budgeted film that had written into it a role for a movie star and had been expertly marketed and had turned into a monster hit and had made stars of Matt Damon and Ben Affleck at that point. And Fox, as Judge explained to Entertainment Weekly, by this stage suddenly wasn't really as keen on the people that he wanted to cast in the movie. Now again, Judge at this point was considering his position on the film, as Fox in particular was pushing try and get Matt Damon in the movie. But that wasn't the film that Judge wanted to make. Matt Damon was not who he saw in one of the roles here. He still took a meeting with Damon, who then was early in his career, but it just didn't gel. It didn't work for him. And so the bit that really turned it, from what I can glean from Judge's interviews, is the audition of Ron Livingston. Now, Nancy Klopper was the casting director for Office Space, and Livingston, who'd had a role in Swingers, that had become a good indie hit, had asked for a meeting on the film. He liked the script and he duly did his audition. And as he said to Entertainment Weekly, I did a damn good audition. He said, I commandeered Nancy's desk, that's Nancy Klopper, started using her drawers, files and the phone. And Klopper then took the tape that they'd filmed of Livingston at work and sent it to Mike Judge immediately. And our Judge was over in New York at the point, so he wasn't close, but he was quickly sold on that. And he saw Livingston in the movie. It's just like, right, he's back in this. He knows what he wants. And he was enthused. You know, this was a way forward for the film. Fox at this stage as well was realising it really wasn't going to get big massive stars for this movie. And also the studio brass liked Livingston's tape as well. But still, it couldn't rid itself of the idea that a star name would be really quite useful to try and sell this one. That there must be something they could do with the lead female role in the film of Joanna. And this is where they struck lucky, because at this stage Jennifer Aniston was a star on TV off the back of the then fast-growing TV show Friends, have you heard of that? But less so in film. I mean, she turned up in Edward Burns' film She's the One, which is effectively a slightly more expensive remake of his breakthrough movie, The Brothers McMullen. I think that She's the One is a really smart film, actually. I really like it. But it was also an era where if you were a star on TV, that didn't instantly mean you were a star in film, that there was still an element of church and state about TV and film acting, whereas now, 20, 30 years on, we see people cross between both media with no problem whatsoever. Now, Aniston had seen the script to Office Space and she loved it. This was just the kind of screenplay that she wasn't being sent. She was being sent lots of rom-coms and stuff that was fairly close to her friend's persona. But here was a smart satirical comedy with the problem that it was a smaller role than you would expect for a star name. But still, she was happy to be on board. That they joked in the oral history piece on Office Space that her agent can't have been too happy, but Aniston was much more enthused about it. Now, this was a turning point for the film, because suddenly Fox had its star. It had someone it could sell the movie around, at least in theory, come into that. And Judge then could put together the bulk of the cast that he wanted. The pressure to cast quite such high-profile names was over. So people like Vince Vaughn and Owen Wilson came in and auditioned, and for the role concerned, that Mike Judge, this is the role of Lawrence, would give the part to Diedrich Bader instead, who was perhaps a less obvious choice. Now, I would suggest that the other masterstroke of casting of Office Space is Gary Cole. Now, Gary Cole in this one plays Bill Lumbergh. I played a little clip of him at work at the start. Now, Gary Cole at this stage in his career was known for the TV show Midnight Caller. He was a dramatic TV star. But he'd made one comedy movie at that stage. Now, that one comedy movie is a film I bang on about an awful lot, the Brady Bunch movie. Now, to us here in the UK, the Brady Bunch wasn't really a thing. And so when the Brady Bunch movie played in UK cinemas, it didn't get a huge audience. It had me, and I laughed a lot and think Gary Cole is great in it. And in fact, when the sequel to it came around, a very Brady sequel, that didn't even get a cinema release in the UK, and instead was held up by the BBFC because it had nunchucks in it, and it was felt it'd be a harmful film to have out there. Who knew? So Cole knew going into his audition that he wasn't really known as a comedy performer, but as Mike Judge said, as Cole came in and did his he made the character, quote, 10 times funnier and completely blew them away. There was no way Gary Cole was not going to take a role on in this film. But with Aniston on board as well, Fox, it's worth noting, still wanted a bit more comedy in the script. And the feeling was they needed to write a bit more for Jennifer Aniston's character and just beef it up a little bit. So there was still some late work going on the screenplay. But on the 4th of May, 1998, production began on Office Space. Cameras rolled across in Florida and Texas. And it's worth noting, the filming began in Texas and it was hot. It was the middle of a heat wave at that point. The kind of heat wave where the smoke from fires was changing the colour of the skies in Austin, which meant that an exterior traffic jam scene that comes in the opening credits of the movie, the filming of that kept having to be postponed because the sky just looked wrong. Now, it was Judge's first live action film. I've said that before, but crucially here, he didn't pretend he knew everything. So he brought in as director of photography Tim Serstead. And Serstead had helped him, and Judge was open about this. I find this quite rare. He was open about this in an interview with the New York Daily News, where he said that it was Serstead who was teaching him about things like lenses and where to place the camera and how to shoot a live action sequence. And I think that reflects well on Judge, really, that he was open about sharing the credit and giving the credit there. Now, in terms of where a lot of the pre-production attention had been, it was building this office that they wanted, this really homogenous, bland, miserable office in which to do the interiors for the movie. They also, and this added expense, it ate up a little bit extra of that $10 million. They wanted tall cubicles, so when Gary Cole's character ambles along, he's got something to lean on. And Judge was absolutely on top of the office details and how they had to be right. And also things like how the character Milton had to have really, really strong glasses, played by Stephen Root in the film, of course, to the point where he was wearing very, very thick lenses and he couldn't really see very well when they were shooting, and he had to wear contact lenses underneath the glasses to be able to see. There was, there's a lovely story that a couple of stapler manufacturers, Boston and Bostitch, refused permission for their staplers to be used in Office Space, and instead a stapler manufacturer by the name of Swingline would give that permission, and in the aftermath of the film's release, it would release a red stapler for the first time to reflect its use in Office Space. There's also, it's worth noting, a printer that doesn't come out particularly well from the movie. That is an infamous scene as well. If you you've not seen it in the film, you've probably seen it as an internet meme. Of course, by that stage, 20th Century Fox hadn't. I mean, internet memes weren't a thing there. And what do you know? It was really worried by some of the early footage that it was seeing, that it was being sent back from the shoot. And in particular, they wanted Ron Livingston's character, who plays Peter Gibbons in the movie, to smile more. That was the feedback that Mike Judge was getting from studio executives as production rolled on. And of course, he pushed back on this, and you can see that in the final film. But it was quite delicate, the comedy that he was looking to put across here, and it didn't look good on daily footage that was going back to the studio. Judge, I mean, it should be noted, was allowing improvisation from his cast. He was allowing them to experiment. And I mean, it goes against slightly a different Entertainment Weekly article that talks about how on the set, I'll quote from the article, it says, back on the set, Judge looks anything but relaxed. The director twiddles his wedding ring in his mouth as producer Daniel Rappaport needles him about his inexperience, saying, did you remember to put film in the camera? And crew members pester him for a few trademark voices, and he just found himself in an unusual situation here, not for the last time on a live action set, but this was a directorial debut that he was making his way through, one that he got wrapped up on the 29th of June 1998, and so it was into post-production. Now, it's not like the most taxing film technically to edit this one, but the test screenings got underway. And they'd put a soundtrack of gangster rap songs to the movie at this stage. And as Mike Judge explained, when Tom Rothman of Fox saw the first cut of the film, he told them, you've got to take out the gangster rap. And Judge did a deal. He said, if the next focus group doesn't like it, he said, okay, I'll take that music out. And so at the next focus group, the moderator of the group, Julie, said to the assembled people, what do you think of the music? And it was a 19-year-old in that focus group who said, what's great is that the movie has gangster rap, but these guys work in an office. And Rothman looked over at Judge at that point and just said, yeah, you win at that. Now, the Judge was still having problems with the film himself in post-production, that he said, coming out of the last test screening, I had an epiphany of what the ending should be. And he talked then about, he realised the third act of the film needed a complete rewrite. And he said you could feel how it should have ended. So that was kind of a bummer. But by that stage, he was stuck with the ending that he got and the 89-minute cut of the movie that was duly going to be released in cinemas. Now, at this stage, there was still some enthusiasm for its possible performance. That there was talk of doing Office Space 2 ahead of the release. In fact, again, a completely different, Entertainment Weekly article they talk of doing Beavis and Butthead 2, which ironically is only now happening at the point we're recording, and of doing Office Space 2. But the problem was, and it was the problem that was never resolved, how could 20th Century Fox market a satire? The answer to that was not very well. That this was a film that really needed carefully curating, and it was not carefully curated. And to the point where the poster design for the film came with the tagline, "Work sucks." That was it. That was the tagline on the film. And then the main image of the poster that was designed was of a man covered in post-it notes. And Judge would just, he was open then, he was open now. He says, I wasn't a fan of the marketing. He said we were polar opposite on everything. That the man in post-it notes was just described as looking like Big Bird. And, I'm looking at a picture as I'm reading it, as I'm talking to you now. Yeah, it looks like Big Bird. And there's Big Bird on a poster with "Work Sucks" written above and "Office Space" written underneath. And that's your lot. I mean, what do you do with that? And he said, they sent me 8 different cuts of the trailer. There were only 2 versions I absolutely hated, and those were their favourites. And he said it was a very difficult movie to market. I mean, they came up with a stunt of, and I covered this in an article on the Film Stories website a while back, of having someone sat in a glass cubicle above Times Square in New York City for 4 or 5 days to promote Office Space. But I've got to tell you, that did not lead to queues going around the block to see the film. They also felt in the end that they couldn't really lean heavily on Jennifer Aniston in the promotion for the film because she just wasn't in it enough. As much as she was the highest profile star in the film, her role in it is a supporting role, and there was no way around that. And it got to the point that as they headed towards the ultimate release date of February the 19th, 1999, and that it really is, I mean, by 1999 standards, that's Fox dropping the film in a graveyard slot, really. They knew this wasn't going to hit. The tracking was at a point where they knew the film was going to flop before it hit a cinema, and what do you know? The film flopped. It was. I'm really reticent to use phrases like box office bomb and things like that because I don't really think they're that accurate. And in the case of Office Space, it had only cost 10 million to make, although it had also cost a fair amount of money to market and to push around the world and to distribute. But no getting away from it. It opened in 8th place at the box office. And it wasn't even the biggest opener that week. There's a film called October Sky, which I think is really underrated, actually. That opened in 4th place with 5.9 million. You have to go quite the way down to see Office Space sat there in 8th place with 4.2 million. The number one film that week was Payback. That's Brian Helgeland again and Mel Gibson. That was on its 3rd week and it only grossed 10 million to hold the top spot at that point. The Kevin Costner film Message in a Bottle was in 2nd place. Not a bad movie, that. And the other films hanging around at that point, things like My Favourite Martian, was doing a bit of money. Blast from the Past, that's an underrated movie. That was around. Shakespeare in Love was in the midst of its Oscar run, so that had gone up to, that was sitting in 6th place. She's All That was around. Rushmore was around. Saving Private Ryan was still hanging around after 31 weeks. But if you're looking 31 weeks later to see if Office Space would remain in the top 10, it didn't even make it to the 2nd week. The following week, films like 8mm, 200 Cigarettes and The Other Sister were released, pushed it firmly out. By the time Office Space completed its American box office run, 10.8 million it had grossed. And it just a nothing, really, in terms of what Fox's expectations were. It would only add another million. I love on Box Office Mojo that it says the overseas box office for the film was $446 million. That's not actually technically true. It made $1 million or $2 million outside of the US, but there was no way anyone was going to spin this as a massive hit. And Mike Judge was quite disheartened by him. But sometimes it's not how many people see the film, it's who see the film. And amongst the people who are seeing the film were people who wanted to meet Mike Judge. Michael Bolton doesn't come out of the film particularly well. If you know the movie, you know which bit I'm talking about. But he's kind of embraced the fun of that now. But people like Jim Carrey, people like Madonna, they were interested and meeting Mike Judge. And there was a feeling, I'd like to work with you. And this film is going to find its audience. And over time, it would do, but not immediately, because Judge and his team just asked Fox, just come up with something different for the DVD release. Don't go with that same artwork. Do something. But Fox put out a bland DVD with the same artwork on. And what would change the fortunes of the movie wouldn't be initially that DVD release. It was when the film landed on Comedy Central in the US. That it got its premiere on there. And then Comedy Central programmed it dozens of times. And each time Comedy Central showed the movie, the audience for it started to swell. The word of mouth, finally, that Office Space was one of the smartest American studio comedies in a long time. Well, that word was starting to get out there. And in fact, as I do read other magazines, but another Entertainment Weekly article says, reported 4 years later, it said in the 4 years since the movie's release, Office Space, a glorious send-up of 9 to 5 absurdities and humiliations. And it's worth noting, reviews weren't that kind when it came out. But Entertainment Weekly says it's evolved into a stealth blockbuster. And it had. It took its time, but 4 years after it came out, it had sold 2.6 million copies on VHS and on DVD. It had become a cult classic, as it's been described. But the DVD kept selling. It kept being in the end of year top 20 best-selling DVDs done by Fox. And then by the end of 2006, it was said that 6 million copies of Office Space had sold on DVD. And that was a sizable hit. Now, there was talk of doing more Office Space spin-offs and bits and bobs. And in fact, off the back of Office Space, Mike Judge got the call to see if he was interested in bringing the television series The Office from the from the UK to the US, which he declined in the end. But he opted in the end also not to continue the Office Space story, and he would go and direct a couple of other films that, well, the same problem that 2006's Idiocracy is a terrific film. Again, struggled to find its audience. 2009's Extract. It's a really good film. Again, struggled to find its audience. And maybe that's the thing with Mike Judge, that his films aren't built for a mass market studio marketing campaign, but they are built to be found on word of mouth. And his 3 live action efforts to date that he has directed, that has been the case with all of them. With Office Space, I do think that if you've not seen it, do seek it out. It really is some piece of work. You'll be doing Gary Cole impressions for the rest of the day, I would politely suggest. Which all brings me to I'm not going to do a Gary Cole impression. It all brings me to the end of this episode of Film Stories, and as always, thank you so much for your time and thank you for listening. If I've not bored you completely, you can get more from me on Twitter at Simon Brew. You can get more at the Film Stories project on Twitter, also at Film Stories Pod. The website is filmstories.co.uk. That's updated every weekday with movie news, reviews, features, bits and bobs like that. All sorts of nerdisms going on. If you go to store.filmstories.co.uk, you can buy our magazines, Film Stories Magazine, Film Stories Junior Magazine. I've got some news to tell you about both of those that's coming up soon, but back issues and pre-ordering of new issues, that's all available there. We're on Facebook at facebook.com/filmstoriesonline, youtube.com/filmstories. I think that's it, really. I think I've waffled at you for a very long time. I've also got another special episode coming your way in a few days' time. So for now, I'm going to leave you in peace. I'm going to thank you so much for your time. I'm going to thank you for listening. I'm going to ask you to stay safe and be well. I'll be back soon with another bunch of film stories. Bye-bye.
I'm gonna kill him. Anyone that was involved, anybody who profited from it, anybody who opens their eyes at me.